It's time now for Korea Book Club, our weekly segment where we dive into the world of Korean literature and books through works available in Korean and in English translations as well. Joining us is cultural essayist Colin Marshall and host of the podcast Kore의 한국. Colin, hello. It's great to have you with us again.
Glad to be here, Dongo.
Okay, so Colin, sometimes we cover translated books here and sometimes we cover untranslated books in Korean. But today, you've brought in a Korean book about translation itself, right?
Yes, it's by Hong Han-byeol, a translator whose name will be familiar to more than a few Korean readers of foreign literature. In English-speaking countries, the idea of a famous translator is something of a contradiction in terms. One reason for that is that translated books make up a far smaller part of the market there than they do in a country like Korea. Another reason is that, also unlike in English-speaking countries, the translator of a book into Korean is usually credited on the cover. So if you enjoy one translated book, you might then seek out other books by different authors from the same translator. Indeed, some Korean translators have played what we could call taste-making roles here, introducing their personal favorite writers to the Korean public, and in some cases, winning them readerships more enthusiastic than the ones they have back in their own countries. It happens sometimes. Now, Hong Han-byeol has been a prolific translator, and in fact, award-winning as well, from English to Korean for about 20 years now, a little more than that. And in that time, she's worked on books by a fair few writers whose names our listeners will know, like Noam Chomsky, Pearl S. Buck, Susan Sontag, Catherine Mansfield, Kazuo Ishiguro, Rebecca Solnit, Claire Keegan, and Joan Didion, to name just a few. And in a way, that list may give you a sense of the influences on her own writing and thinking, which are on display in 흼에, 흼에 대하여, this essay collection that she published just a few months ago.
Right, so first, if we translate that title into English, you've translated it for us as On the Power of the White Whale. So it's an intriguing title, and for any listeners who grew up reading English language literature, I imagine there's only one white whale in particular that will come to mind.
Right, the association is very quick to arrive. In the West, at least, the idea of a white whale, or an improbable goal that grows into a lifelong obsession, has long been a powerful one, and it's powerful enough, in fact, that it now floats somewhat free of its origin. Of course, it comes from Herman Melville's Moby Dick, or The Whale, a novel widely recognized as a masterpiece of American literature, but most often invoked in popular culture as a byword for sheer length and difficulty. That's how we all hear of it in the first place, right? Well, let's face it. Though I wouldn't call Moby Dick quite as hard to read as it's reputed to be, nor would I envy its translator the task of bringing the book's 135 chapters into Korean. Now, Hong Han-byeol takes as an example chapter 42 of Moby Dick, titled The Whiteness of the Whale, in which the narrator, Ishmael, makes an extended philosophical consideration of that color alone. And for all that effort, he still can't quite pin down all the qualities of this specific whale's whiteness, a kind of failure to which the work of any literary translator is also, in a sense, doomed. You can approximate the work of one language in another, but you can never truly replicate it, can you?
Right, even translating that chapter, I imagine, will be difficult, trying to find all the different Korean words for white
all the equivalents
as well.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's an interest I've particularly been interested in over the years as well, as a bilingual working in media. But for many people, even if translators are credited on the covers of the books we read nowadays, many probably don't give much thought to the work of translation itself, except when there's actually perhaps somewhat awkward or inelegant translation. A good translation is, in that sense, I guess, invisible. It's meant to be, I guess, but producing one is hardly a straightforward task, I found.
And it hasn't been that way since antiquity, at least, if you believe the myth of Babel. In that biblical story, humanity dares to attempt to build a tower to heaven, and for that act of hubris receives the punishment from God of being forced to speak all different, mutually incomprehensible language. So the myth of the origin of the variety of human language.
Right.
Hong Han-byeol writes about the Tower of Babel in 흼에, 흼에 대하여, telling a story of how the concept of translation has itself been regarded throughout history. And she discusses classical works like the Bible itself, translations of which have proven both highly influential and highly controversial, as well as the sonnets and plays of Shakespeare, and Dante's Inferno, whose early French translations inspired the Italian phrase traduttore traditore, or translator, traitor, which Hong Han-byeol renders in Korean as 번역가 배신자. And I'd always thought that 번역, 반역 would have worked neatly, but not being a native Korean speaker, I could be missing a nuance that doesn't quite work there. That's probably the case. In any case, the idea is that the translator is always forced to portray, to one degree or another, either the original text or the readers of the translation. You can't be 100% faithful to the meaning of the source text while also being 100% faithful to the nature of the target language. It's impossible. Hong Han-byeol cites minds no less powerful than Walter Benjamin or Walter Benjamin, if we want to use the correct German pronunciation, Vladimir Nabokov as well, both of whom advocated for the most literal translations possible, no matter how inelegant or laden with footnotes the results became. Now, mass market success usually requires more liberal translation, which allows for rewriting or even rearrangement in the name of a more pleasing or accessible reading experience. In practice, a translator constantly faces the choice between literal and liberal translation on a spectrum, really, which presents itself even in the simplest sentences. Hong Han-byeol brings out a host of examples, the first of which we'll all remember from our childhoods. I have a lot of homework. Now, you could translate that sentence literally into Korean as 나는 많은 숙제를 가졌다, but no native Korean speaker would ever say that.
Right.
It does give the reader, though, a sense of how the speaker is articulating himself in the original English. So it does give you something. Alternatively, you could translate the sentence liberally as 숙제가 많다, which sounds perfectly natural in Korean, though that doesn't automatically designate it as a correct translation. There are many options, all of which could sound natural in Korean.
Right. And if you reverse that, that would be awkward in English.
Exactly.
Exactly. Homework loads of. That doesn't quite work either.
Yeah, that even works even less well.
It's not just the phrasing. There are obviously vocabularies of untranslatable words as well out there. Famously, things like nunchi, or even honorifics such as oppa and hyung. Yeah. These are all challenges when the cultures are so different, not just the words itself. So those examples that, I mentioned just there, those are Korean to English translation, which I'm more familiar with. But Hong translates from English to Korean. However, it seems as that her observations about the task of a translator would apply when going in any direction, really. Does she have much to say about the ways in which Korean literature has been translated into English, which I think our listeners would be very interested in as well?
Decades ago, the translation of Korean literature into English was mainly the province of academics. Professors did it, and they tended toward literal translation, the better to preserve the nuances of the original text and to transmit their cultural context. Now, even short stories didn't come out as particularly easy reads when translated that way. But much changed with the success of Shin Kyung-suk's 엄마를 부탁해, which came out in English in 2011 as Please Look After Mom, and which listeners may remember hearing Barry Welsh discuss here on the Korea Book Club, in fact, not long ago. Now, that book won the 2011 Man Asian Literary Prize, and even got the nod from no less an influencer than Oprah Winfrey. That owes to the quality of Shin Kyung-suk's original text, of course, but also to that of Kim Ji-young's translation, which actually made some fairly dramatic changes to the structure of the novel, usually something you don't see happen you never see it in literal translation, but it's even rare in liberal translation. Now, opinions differ as to whether that kind of change counts as translation or betrayal, of course, but Hong Han-byeol also addresses the similar literary controversy that erupted a few years later when The Vegetarian, Deborah Smith's English translation of Han Gang's 채식주의자, came under scrutiny after winning the 2016 Man Booker International Prize. And most at issue was its transposition of the spare, almost austere prose of the original into a more loquacious-sounding, at times near Dickensian, register, very different from the original. A year or two ago, I heard one long-established translator of Korean literature describe that book as not a translation, but an adaptation, in his word. Now, however you conceive of it, the fact remains that The Vegetarian put Han Gang on the path to winning the Nobel Prize last year. So the potential of liberal translation, even very liberal translation, clearly isn't to be dismissed out of hand.
Right, as you said, this is an age-old debate. I've always thought that you can give the same book to two different translators, and while they may have the same plot points, they will likely be very different in style and tone. And
it never comes out the same way twice.
Exactly. Because of that, I don't think there really is a perfect translation as such, especially in literature. You can't get too bogged by that. But I think this book sounds like a fascinating exploration of some of these ideas. Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there. The book has been called 흰 고래의 힘이 대하여 by Hong Han-byeol, and that was our pick for Korea Book Club this week. Colin, thank you for another great review, and we'll talk to you next time. Take care.
Talk to you soon.
And that brings us to the end of another edition of Korea 24. Today we have a little bit of time left to remind you of the various ways you can listen to our show. You can tune in via our website, world.kbs.co.kr, or through our apps, KBS Kong, KBS World Radio, and KBS World Radio on Air. You can also catch up on past episodes as a podcast. Just search for KBS Korea 24 on your favourite podcast platform. KBS World Radio is also available on shortwave in various regions as well. For details on frequencies, please visit our website. And finally, we have a looped YouTube live stream of KBS World Radio's English language service where you can listen to all of our English shows throughout the day. Just search for KBS World English on YouTube. And that wraps up our show for today. We'll be back tomorrow, so we hope you can join us again then. I've been your host, Kwon Jang-ho, and thank you as always for listening. Goodbye.